As they're setting up the stage, we are getting ready to have our first panel. We're having a panel on transracial adoption today, on transracial adoption. That is where adoptive parents or parents, adults adopt kids that are of a different race, okay? So we're going to talk about what that looks like, the ramifications of that, and those of you who that might be your family makeup, how you can do that well. So our moderator for the next few minutes will be none other than Erin Naismith. Erin is a co-founder. Thank you for welcoming her to the stage. Erin is a co-founder and executive director of Adoption Support Alliance, a nonprofit founded in 2014 to support adoptive families through the unique challenges of building their family forever. She's had a passion with working with adoption since high school, where she volunteered at an orphanage in China and Vietnam. She has since worked within the foster care system as a child mental health clinician and is a social worker conducting home studies for families pursuing adoption. One more time, please welcome Erin. Our first panelist will be Mary Culp. Mary is and her husband Dave have 3 biological daughters and felt led to adopt out of the foster care system, completing their family and adding 2 siblings. They adopted transracially in 2014. Mary recognized just how vital it was to be immersed in a supportive community that understands the complexities that come with growing a family through adoption. And one of those complexities for the Culp family was a changing perspective on race and its importance in her family's life. Can we please welcome Mary to the stage? Our next panelist, Merlene Mondesir, is a transracial adoptee from Haiti. Merlene was adopted at the age of 3 into a family from North Carolina. She has a desire to work with people who have been touched by adoption. Over the years, Merlene has worked alongside adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive parents. Her passion is to provide pre- and post-adoption support to adoptees and their families. Merlene is currently working towards her master's degree in social work so she can grow her passion into serving more families in a greater way. For all my social media folks, please follow her on Instagram at adoptee_to_adoptee. And so can you all join me in welcoming Merlene to the stage? And lastly, we have Molly Mayhoff. Molly and her husband are the parents of 2 sons who both joined their family through domestic adoption at birth. Molly, her husband, and her oldest son are white. Her youngest son is black. After her youngest son joined the family, Molly began the necessary work of educating herself on issues of race and how to help her son develop a strong racial identity. While approaching this work as a perpetual student herself, Molly has had the privilege of facilitating groups through Adoption Support Alliance using the Be the Bridge curriculum for transracial adoptive families. Will you all please welcome Molly to the stage? Thank you all so much for being here, our transracial adoption panel.
Thank you so much. Did y'all feel like we're on like a basketball team and we just got, that was a great way to start. Thank you so much for having us today. I think this is a topic that is obviously really important to us, and we do this kind of work and have these conversations every day. I don't know that it's always thought of as a justice issue, so we feel really privileged and honored to be here and share talk today. Okay, y'all ready? Okay, so first question is, what do you guys wish that the broader culture understood about transracial adoption? Mary, you're on the hot seat first.
All right, I'll go first. Thanks again for having us. I would say that we really need to continue educating ourselves. I think maybe I won't speak for all of us, really naive at the beginning of what transracial adoption was going to look like. And so just the need of knowledge of the complexity for the child coming into our home and how they're forming their racial identity. And it's going to be even more confusing being in our home. So our 2 kiddos we adopted through foster care, and we're a multiracial family, multi-ethnic family. I'm still learning the right things to say, so I think part of that is admitting that we still don't know all the things. And so having a heart and a posture of humility and acknowledgement that there's a lot out there to learn and there are a lot of resources available, but it's our job to learn and not to put that on our kids.
That's good. Marilyn, what about you? What do you think
Okay.
wish people knew?
I do love how you mentioned that the truth was every adoption begins with a loss. And I think that is really important to keep that in your mind, especially with intercultural, transracial adoptions. There is a lot of loss. You're losing your culture, you're trying to figure out your identity. A lot of the adoptees are going to deal with imposter syndrome and where they fit in. So for me, and there's idea that just because you're adopted, you should be thankful for everything. And I think that that's a fallacy, and have the community kind of just let adoptees feel, and even if you don't understand the feelings, but just to sit with them and try to understand.
Molly?
Yeah, and I'll echo a little bit of what Mary touched on. We definitely went into our adoptions totally unprepared. I have one older son who is white that is adopted, and my younger son is black. And I can speak to the difference between going into a second adoption, feeling like we knew things as far as, okay, this is how we honor birth family, this is how we work with a child. And it was totally different with a transracial adoption. And the training that we received on the front end prior to connecting with ASA, as far as a home study, there's just a total lack of education that's out there. And it's mandatory, like it's not optional. If you're going to go into a transracial adoption, these are things that you should be talking about prior to a child entering your home. Unfortunately, I didn't enter those conversations until afterwards. And so I guess my perspective being in it is, if you're considering it, if you're looking into it, if you want to know more about it, there are so many resources out there, and adult adoptees are telling their stories, and we really need to elevate what they're saying and listen to them and use that to educate potential adoptive parents and anyone who already is in a multiracial family through adoption.
Can you guys, Molly and Mary, can you guys speak to when you say you weren't as prepared as you wanted to be, or you didn't know what you didn't know maybe? Can you now, looking back on that, speak specifically to the things that you've had to learn or stretch yourselves around?
Yeah, I mean, I was racially illiterate. I hadn't done the work of really understanding what it meant to be white. And so I wasn't even entering that space in order to be able to have a home where my son could develop a healthy racial identity, because I hadn't done the work to understand what my racial identity was and what whiteness meant and the culture there. I was just ignorant, and I had the privilege of not having to really enter into those conversations and be able to live my life not engaging in that. And I quickly saw how wrong I was and how much work I needed to do. And it's part of why I think conversations like this are important, because families are being formed this way, and a lot of agencies don't have that support, and they're not having these conversations on the front end, and there's a lack of preparation there that I experienced that I wish I hadn't.
Yeah, I would add just how many blind spots were in my life just as a person, our family's life, just how we operated within the city, the circles we kept, where we went to the park, who I went to see as my primary care physician, or just being aware of all the opportunities for windows and mirrors, really, for my kids, that I was not prepared to see how white my world really was. And it was a good hard, if I can say it like that. It was helpful. And so I think also just realizing there was a gift of a community around me who wanted to learn with us. but recognizing that there were also some folks who didn't really want to step into those spaces, and that was hard. And so part of the loss that my children faced, I needed to be willing to face loss as well. And if it was letting go of friendships and challenging dynamics, then that is a gift for me to let go of those, because my loss will never compare to what they lost.
Marilyn, did you have thoughts about, I know you were living it, you weren't having to do the preparation ahead of time. Are there things that you wished maybe you wish adoptive parents in general had learned before going into this process?
That's a lot.
I can always rely on you to
Well, I mean, because my platform is education, education, education. And I mean, there's so many facets, so many things that adoptive parents can learn. I'll say this. I think when a lot of adoptive parents, they're plugged into a church and they feel as though God has called them, and that's wonderful and that's great, but that's not it. I mean, that's just the beginning. You don't just stop there. And I think there is this, trigger word, white saviorism complex. And in order to combat that, education is important. Look around, like they were saying about the surroundings. Do you have any black, brown friends? What kind of church do you go to? How are your family members going to accept a transracial child? Because I think those, especially with family members, there's a lot of hidden biases and prejudices that can happen. So I can go on and talk forever, but that's just one of my things.
You have 24 minutes and 55, I'm just kidding. As we think about, this maybe is a trigger word too, but as we think about the adoption industry, right? Because it's an industry, there are hundreds of businesses around this idea of families adopting children. What do you wish was different about that industry in terms of how it relates to transracial adoptions? Molly, can we start with you?
So as I mentioned, I have two sons, but both were domestic adoptions as infants. So I'll speak specifically to that industry because that's where my knowledge lies. But domestic adoption is highly, highly unregulated. Every state has different laws. There's no caps in some states on financial portions of it. There's just a lot of free range for agencies, and there's so much control that is in the hands of agencies right now. And there's financial benefit for them. And so I think the word industry is just a part that really I wish could be removed from adoption, because where there's money, there's corruption. And I think that, speaking from my experience, there's some agencies that discount a transracial adoption. And so they're financially incentivizing families to enter into a transracial adoption without providing support, without that education.
Can I say that part again? When she says they discount transracial adoptions, it means that the adoptive parents pay less money to say yes to a child of color than they would pay to have a white, healthy infant.
Yeah, and sometimes it's rolled up into underneath a special needs category. And so there's so much financially there with domestic adoptions, and there's so much regulation that needs to be there. There's so much control from an adoptee's standpoint that they don't have access to their actual birth certificate, things like that to me are big justice issues across the board with adoption, but especially when you're talking about transracial and you're talking about the economics that are there, not to mention the way that they're advertising for potential birth mothers. And there's just, I could talk time about this, but it's definitely an industry.
I meant to say this at the beginning, that 45 minutes of us up here talking to you guys about this is like very much an appetizer of the information that we could do 45 minutes on each one of these questions really easily. So, and the other thing I wanted to say, just in case if you're not an adoptive parent, why would you not need to know this? But the domestic infant adoptions on average, are about $40,000. So when we're talking about money, that's about the amount we're talking about. There are some that are more expensive, there are some that are less expensive, but that's sort of the average price that we're talking about. And that's pretty comparable to what an international adoption would be too. Just so, as you're talking about the money, I figure let's put numbers to it. Marilyn, what about you? What do you think about the industry and what you wish would be different?
Well, what Molly said is 100%, so I don't really have too much more to add, but just a little thing in regards to, I remember many times overhearing people asking my parents or other adoptive parents how much my adoption cost, and as an adoptee, that kind of sounded like, how much am I worth? So it's just important to kind of be aware of those things.
Like I said, our two youngest kids, we're joined our family through adoption after foster care. We have 3 older biological kiddos, and so I speak from that area. And so for me, what I wish would be different was a lot of the reasons why kids come into care in the first place, which is then looking back at those parents who are struggling for a variety of reasons. No one wakes up and says, I really hope one day I have children who are removed from my care. And so there's a whole host of reasons that it could be, whether it is not access to the health care that they need, or the mental health care that they need, or what does job insecurity look like, or what does housing look like, and just how many layers generationally does it go back that contribute to these families being in crisis. Speaking to just the financial aspect, foster care adoption, sadly, sometimes it's considered like, well, it's just free. Like, why aren't more people just doing it? It's just free. And so considering kids and their needs with a monetary price tag on top, that these are discount. It's painful, and it invalidates their pain, and also it takes away the dignity from their parents, many of whom are trying very hard to get into a place of health. Because it's the primary goal of foster care's reunification, that's where we need to be considering, how do we keep kids out of care, and then if they're in care, how do we reunify them when that is not an option for safety or for other reasons. There needs to be ways that these children are then met with care. Which is more on, I'm excited to hear the mental health panel later today, because I think a lot of it can go with that as well. These kids coming into care all come with trauma. And there's not a lot of resources available for these kids in Charlotte that would either be covered by Medicaid, or that would be in just about anybody's network of providers, and that would be trauma competent. So having more resources and affordability for families that have stepped into this space so that these children can be cared for to the best is a missing piece for sure.
Yeah, that's good. Because I have this handy table in front of me, I have some statistics here to speak to what Mary was saying about the foster care system. And so this is statistics from U.S. Census Bureau of Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, where we are right now. The racial breakdown is 57% white, 33% black, 14% Hispanic, and then it says 2.5% of 2 or more races. So 57 white, 33 black, 14 Hispanic. The racial breakdown of kids in foster care in Mecklenburg County. This is from Congregations for Kids, which is an organization that if you're not familiar with, you should be. They're really great and do a lot of work in the foster care system. So in care, 51% of the children are black, 23% of the children are multiracial, and 17% of the children are Hispanic. Only 9% of the children in foster care are white. So you can see that those numbers are vastly different. So the issues that Mary is talking about, that we know that those things impact whether or not children are taken away from their biological families, whether or not families have the resources they need to care for their children at an adequate level. And there's definitely a lot of systemic problems to how that stuff is happening that kind of lead us to the point where we have lots of white families adopting Black and brown children out of the foster care system. Okay, let's move to a really comfortable conversation topic, which is how the church plays a role in all of this. We know that the church plays a huge role in adoption, right? A lot of people, I think Marilyn mentioned earlier, feel called to build their family through adoption, and that is right, and that is good, but that is a beginning. That is not an end. And we tend to see that when churches start talking about adoption, you see congregations that are sort of full of these multi-ethnic, multiracial families running around, and we cluster together because that feels safe and it's good for our kids and all of that. So as we think about those trends happening in the church, what do you guys see as problematic in the way that churches talk about adoption, or ways that you wish that we would talk about it differently in the church context? Ready? Who wants to go first? Mirlyn. You haven't gone first yet.
Oh, okay. I think the church definitely does perpetuate the saviorism mentality. And I guess just to kind of echo what I said before, just about how, sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Being called to adoption, that's great. I'm never going to question that. All of that stuff. But one of my things that I struggle with growing up and seeing, like she said, adoptees and adoptive parents kind of cluster together because it feels safe. And I was fortunate enough to know a lot of transracial adoptees in my church. So that was something that was really important to me, and maybe, adoptive parents should seek that out as well. But kind of, I think the church is kind of, people hide under Christianity, and that is one thing I struggle with my walk, and just seeing church-going people and hearing stories about how the lack of information, the ignorance, and just the treatment that can happen behind closed doors. And I don't think that the church, or maybe just provide more accountability, I think. So, yeah, that's...
I got a lot. Yeah, I think that I would just personally like to remove James 1:27 from adoption narratives. I think that when you talk about religion as pure and faultless is this, to look after widows and orphans, and it really I understand the intention there, right? So I want to give grace for that, but I think that from an adoptive parent perspective, I see where that lands me, right? That puts me in the pure and faultless category, which I certainly am not. Like, I'm a broken individual. I made mistakes. I shared that I came into this not knowing what I should have. So putting adoptive parents and elevating them in that way, and I've even been turning over the term called to adopt, because I think that is tied to ministry a lot, and I push back on adoption and ministry going into the same lane, because it's not a charity, it's family, right? So we're building families and we're living life together, and adoption is not a good thing that I did. I've been blessed immensely by it because I love my children, but it began with loss. It's hard, it's complex. I didn't fall on my sword and save a child. That's not what happened, and I think that that's the narrative that's being shared out there, and I think that it's really detrimental to the whole family, the whole unit. It often ignores birth parents and just eliminates them from the triad. It elevates adoptive parents, and it puts that burden on adoptees to feel grateful.
Right.
And to be grateful for something that they lost. And so I just think that any mirroring from adoptive families to, like, God adopted us into his family, that just, it can get dangerous. It puts us in the wrong spot.
Well said. Well said.
So my husband is a pastor. That's awesome. So it comes up a lot, the whole how does the church interact with adoption? And it can be church specific. Some churches do it really well, some churches do it really poorly. In general, I feel like it's still safe to say that there is a lot of need for growth, regardless of what kind of a church you think you might fall into. So often it's this glorified version of this happy family, and it's just, isn't it beautiful? And there is truth that the Lord has done some beautiful things, and we have to look at the complete story. And so that can, in our church, it looks like how do we spend our resources, our time, our energy coming around those families? It's not just the one day that the adoption occurred and then we move forward. It is, what does the long-term care for families look like? How do we come alongside these kids long-term so that we're well-informed congregants? It's not just my family or the others from our church that have adopted, but it's, if we're all called to step into places and love others, we need to know who we're loving, and we've got to understand what that looks like. And so there's so many resources just in Charlotte, but also, especially now in our day and age when everything is online, there's a wealth of resources available of how, from what type of terminology to use or not use, what types of examples might be hurtful in a sermon, or and just being open to receiving feedback and not being fearful to offer it. I know sometimes it's the one, the burden is sometimes put on the child or the adult adoptee or that family just to say, ooh, that might have been insensitive, what was just shared. And so maybe sometimes just stepping into that space so that they're not the only one to have to notice it or see it, but we have to be willing to see our blind spots and have our eyes opened in order to speak and use our voice.
Can I just add one more
Please.
thing? And just, and I guess on a more positive note as well, but the church that I grew up in, they definitely did, they covered me, I guess in a way, like showered me with love, and there were some people that I felt like were kind of like, they didn't understand, but they were there. And kind of like what you were saying, it takes a community, it takes the whole church, and they didn't necessarily have the right things to say necessarily, but for the people who tried, those are the ones that I remember.
I want to take liberties and answer my own question, if that's okay with you guys, a little bit. Part of my role at Adoption Support Alliance is that I'm a LCSW, so I counsel families who mostly adoptive families. And one of the things I see that I think is harmful from the church is that kids who've experienced trauma, which all adoptees have experienced some level of trauma, there certainly is a range, but they've all experienced trauma. Those kids need a different type of parenting. The parenting style is different, the approach is different, the way that you discipline is different, because their needs are really unique and different. And so sometimes I think that there's a real mismatch in the church, and parents can feel judgment from their church family when they maybe are not as hard line with their kids, or when their kids are talking back to them and they're not taking them out of the room immediately, or if they're not using physical discipline with their children. And so I think that one piece is just a recognition that the church needs to recognize that kids who come from trauma really do need to be parented differently. It's not that it's not unbiblical parenting, it's just that it looks very different from the way that I parent my biological children because their needs are different. And so I think as we talk about a community that cares and sees transracial families, recognizing that difference is good and right for that family is really important, and encouraging them in that, and not, and trying to put aside the judgment of it doesn't look like the way that I did it when I was raising my biological children. So what else do we want to be saying? Does anything come up to you guys? I have one more question, and if there are questions from the audience, we're happy to do that too. Let me just ask you guys, as you come up here, if there are questions from the audience, can you talk about some of the, anytime we do these kinds of things, especially with audiences that maybe don't know adoption, I feel like part of our role is to help everyone understand terminologies, ways to talk about adoption in a way that's respectful. So just give me popcorn style, what are the things that people should not be saying or should be saying instead when they're talking about adoption? You know them all, just jump
Real
in.
child.
Yeah.
Real child. Like,
Instead of
it's
real-
not real. Yes, they're real.
Yes.
They're, you know.
Yes.
And oftentimes it's well intended, but like, is that her brother? Like they're two of our kids are biological siblings, and they've all joined our family through adoption. But we have 3 bio kids, and it's like, yeah, it's really her brother. They really fight. They really.
Right. You're so lucky.
They're so lucky.
Yeah.
Have you guys gotten that one, like Mary and Molly, with your kids at
Yes.
the ages they are? Frequently?
Yes, it's usually in the grocery store.
Yeah. I always hear Walmart stories, like for some reason a lot of these questions happen at Walmart. Yeah.
Orphan is one for me that my children aren't orphans. They have loving biological moms. They were never orphans. So I think that term is just overused with adoption.
I think just being conscious that little kids are listening, even though they're little. And so they might be looking at the gum or the magazine, but they're going to hear even the well-intended question. If you have a question, I think it's helpful. It's an opportunity to build connection, but being mindful of who's around and not shouting it across a room or, being mindful. Little ears, they hear all the things.
And to piggyback off what she said, I think it's also important, like she said, the kids are listening. Let me give an example. When I was younger, I have a older sister and brother, and they're white. And I remember one time somebody asked us, like, oh, well, why is your sister black? And I said, oh, because I was in the oven too long. Now, but I feel like that was like a terrible answer. Like it downed who I am, it downed my blackness, and again, I did it because that was my way of coping. But as parents and people around these adoptive kids, sometimes the kids don't have the words, but in that moment, I don't know where I was exactly, but in that moment, if somebody was around me, just be like, no, she was born this way. She wasn't in an oven, but so just kind of being cognitive of that.
Can we give our panelists a hand? We have some great questions. I believe I'm unmuted, but I'm also going to project until I feel muted. There we go. All right, we have some great questions. The easiest one, I think, is already on the screen. In addition to the resources that are on the screen, what were the most helpful resources, books, organizations, etc., for you prior to and during maybe the adoption process or growing up as an adoptee or after becoming an adult? What were some resources, if there's some additional ones that you can recommend?
A newer one to me was even seeing Dr. Berry here earlier, that felt using the What Lies Between Us curriculum with our community. It's been helpful just to have conversations about race, and then it provided an atmosphere for questions about adoption within it, because not all of them in the group found themselves in that space.
That's good.
This book is kind of controversial, but Primal Womb, I read that as an adult, and it is very validating, and it speaks a lot of truth, and it's hard truth. And then also another resources are adoptees and birth parents, and I say adoptive parents, but adoptive parents have had the platform, for a while. Their voices have been the majority. So if you really want to know, and you're thinking about adoption or have adopted, whatever, talk to your adoptees. They can tell you the truth.
And they
good.
speak a lot on social media, so you can find, they speak candidly on social media. And so that's a really good, it's not, social media is not great for everything, but in this sense, it really is a great place to hear those voices.
That's great. That's great. Here is a perhaps personal question. Feel free to answer or pass. Personal question, tangible ways of how did or do you work with your children's birth parents or your birth parents in ways that honor their cultural heritage and racial identity?
I mean, I can speak a little to that. I think that with birth-parent relationship, it's just really respecting the fact that they're experiencing grief. You want to honor them, but you might have this goal as an adoptive parent to forge this relationship and have all this information, but respecting that you got to go at their pace. So I think you open the door as much as you can open the door, and you reach out as much as you can reach out, but you follow their lead and understand that. Respect where they're at, and respect the fact that they're grieving and that they've lost a great deal, and having compassion and just leaving the door open. And I think that when you don't have that opportunity with a birth parent or a birth family, to reach out to the community around you. I have been blessed by so many people that have shown me grace as I put my foot in my mouth and stumble and try to figure this out. And I'm so grateful for that. And there's community out there. Adoptive parents that are white, I can speak to. Like, you just gotta eat humble pie, and you gotta you gotta put yourself in a situation where you can learn.
One thing I would add to that is we've had to be intentional about finding trusted, great friends, specifically for my son, Black men who are going to be able to speak to things to him that my husband is not going to be able to identify with or speak with any wisdom. My daughter, the younger, she is more naturally around women of color at her school and other places, but my son, it seems like we've had to be more intentional about hard conversations as he's getting older. We can't just stay in our little cocoon.
Yeah, very true.
Merlene, what have been some ways, do you have any ways that you can suggest for that maybe adoptive parents should do from the perspective of the adoptee to honor cultural heritage and racial identity?
Yeah. I think since I'm Haitian and I'm also identifying as African American, I just think trying to naturally incorporate the culture, meaning like having having books that represent, that the kids see themselves in those books. For instance, like Juneteenth, like recognizing all these things. And I love what Molly said, just like eating some humble pie, because it really is true. It's tough. But I know over the years there have been Black women and Black men who have been there for my parents to help them get advice. And then also like learning to do their hair, right? We're not aliens. It's not, it's not too hard to.
but it's important.
Right,
Learning.
it's learning because
Learning.
in the Black culture, I'm just saying, hair is important. And it can be intimidating, I get it, but if you have a child and you're not teaching them these things, going to places where they can't teach, and they also on YouTube and stuff, they have these adoptive parents, actually, these white parents who have learned how to do their children's hair. So you can follow those people or you can follow the Black people, but there are just tons of resources. Just immerse them in as much culture as possible.
That's good. That's good. You said it is an average of $40,000 to adopt a child. Somebody in the room wants to know, where is that money going?
The money goes mostly to pay the professionals who are working to finalize the adoption. So there's a social worker for the birth parent, there's a social worker for the adoptive parent, there's lawyers involved, there's filings of paperwork. In a domestic infant adoption, a big chunk of that money goes to caring for the biological mother as soon as you are matched with your adoptive parent, and the biological mother might need care. She needs a place to live, she needs groceries, she needs transportation to and from doctor's appointments, some of that money is going to support her throughout her pregnancy and usually 6 weeks or so after postpartum to take care of her because she's caring for your child. So that's
helpful.
Yeah.
At what point, if any, would you discourage a transracial adoption? Anybody? I know.
I would even discourage it from the get-go, if that's okay. Like, to say, don't assume that it's going to be great. Like, the first time our social worker came to our house, she said, what are you going to say when this little white woman walks up to you and says, why are your children brown? And I was like ready, and I just knew what my answer was going to be. And then she said, what are you going to say when a nice black woman comes up and asks why your children are brown? And I was like, I have no idea what I do. And that was, she didn't fix it. She didn't come in and say, this is what you say. She let me sit in that discomfort to kind of own it. And so I was thankful from the beginning to have been asked these hard questions. I think if you don't have a community around you, you're not going to adopt in a vacuum. You're not going to parent the next 30 years or till your kids leave the house in a vacuum. You've got to have a community around you. So I think from the very beginning, don't assume the answer is yes.
How has your adoption stories affected how you think or feel about race in the church? Has it? Yeah.
No, you go ahead. No?
Yeah, it's challenged a lot of, I mean, I changed churches after we adopted transracially. Part of that was just to be in a space where there was more racial mirrors for my child, but also I didn't know how much, I didn't see how tied the church was from my experience to race in a political way. And that was a big thing that I learned quickly, that as I started to learn about these things and educate myself and do that mandatory work I talked about, that it suddenly became politicized when I was just talking about my family.
Oh, that's good. All right. All right.
Just checking.
We had a pep talk in the back, and we were like, if you don't want to answer these, just be like, give a signal like pass. Like,
Yeah, right.
So we're good. We're good. All right. Although the children are adopted, how often are the biological parents involved in their child's life? What is that process? And we're going to start this question with Aaron.
Yeah, I can just speak to the general process of that. So in a domestic infant adoption, there is more and more push for what we call openness between biological family and adoptive family throughout the child's life. The research shows over and over again that that's good for everyone involved, that there be some level of conversation, communication after the adoption happens. And so the process for that is when an agency is involved, that they help facilitate that. There's usually a written agreement about what the expectation might be. If there's a connection between an adoptive parent and a birth parent, I mean, I know people who invite their kids' birth parents to birthday parties, spend Christmas together, that kind of thing. I also know families who send letters to their agency, and then the agency then forwards it on to the birth parent. So there's a little bit more of a, mediator in their relationship. So there's a wide variety of what that looks like, but there is more and more of a push for openness. And then with international adoption, it's harder. It's much harder to keep that, though I will say with DNA testing, I feel like the whole world is going to open up over the next several decades. And then in foster care, there's really, it varies a lot based on the reason that the child came into care and if there's a safety issue regarding communication. But, it needs to be something that's agreed upon by all parties, and the most important thing is that it's healthy and safe for the child.
Can we give our panelists a hand for being here today, being so vulnerable, sharing your stories? Thank you so much, ladies. Thank you for being here.